You're not gonna know where I'm at. No, you're not gonna know where I'm at. I'm telling you, you're not gonna know where I'm at. You could be standing in my room, I could be sitting right next to you. You could be combing my hair as I'm clipping my fingernails, but you're not gonna know where I'm at.
You are a freak. In the best sense of the word. People look at you as an oddity. And that comes down to, yeah, what I did to you.
Meet my dad, Russ. He's been fighting against government intrusion since 1982, the year he beat the IRS in a court battle over destroyed records. In 1998, when I was born, my dad decided not to get me a social security number.
At the time, I was involved in the big patriot movement or the tax protest movement. A lot of my friends would drag me off to these meetings. And in those meetings, the issue of the mark of the beast would come up in regards to the Social Security number. And I'd listen to arguments on both sides. And so it's really kind of an opinion more than anything else. So my decision to let you kids make that decision was based on that concept, that I'm not going to decide for you if you want to have a Social Security number or not.
My name is Steve. I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I've lived here my entire life. As far back as I can remember, I've always helped out around the building my dad manages. This is where we keep all the tenants that don't pay rent. At age 12, I began working there as a janitor, and I have ever since. But now that I'm 20 years old, moving out on my own, and I still haven't signed myself up for a Social Security number, I've begun to see how living without one will really affect my future. Before I make the final decision to get a Social Security number, or not, I need to find out what it means that I don't have one, how this number has become so important, and just where Social Security came from.
The Social Security Act became law in 1935 during the depths of the Great Depression. And its original purpose was to create a safety net for Americans, a forced savings program, if you will, for Americans.
When Social Security started, what happened was the country was in extreme distress. People had done everything they could to care for themselves. They'd worked for a company all their life so they could have a good retirement. And then the company went bankrupt, like some of the companies now are. People invested in the stock market so they could have that money when they retired. And the stock market failed in 29 and 30. They invested in real estate, and that failed. They put all their money in the banks. What could be safer than the bank? And the banks failed. So when President Roosevelt came into office, he was facing a crisis of faith in the United States.
And what he did was offer a new deal for America, and he offered a number of alphabetical programs to put America back to work, to put my father's father back to work.
It was a security program that no matter what happened to the stock market or to your employer or to the real estate market or to anything else, the government would ensure that you had money that you'd put away for retirement.
So, Social Security was originally a safety net for Americans. Generally, it still acts as our safety net, but what other roles are Social Security numbers playing these days?
It's just kind of interesting how the Social Security number has become such an important tool in immigration enforcement and in tracking of people in the United States, and maybe that's not really what it was intended for.
This country, the third largest country in the world population-wise, the world superpower, has a vested interest in keeping an awareness of its citizens and those who are in the country, and the best way to do that is by a number.
Social Security number is basically our national identity number. I mean, a lot of people have been very opposed to having a national identity card, but as a practical matter, the number that they assign a person as a Social Security number becomes their national identity number, and without that number, they either don't exist or they have to typically use somebody else's number in order to get employment, to open a bank account, or any number of other things.
Now, nowhere in the Constitution, nowhere in the Declaration of Independence or the Articles of Confederation is there any mention about the need of government to track its people.
Today, nearly every citizen believes that they are required to have this number. But if the Founding Fathers didn't foresee the tracking of their fellow citizens through a number in the Constitution, are we really required to have a Social Security number?
We didn't know you had a choice until, we went down to the driver's license division and said, well, you gotta have one. Then we go down to the Social Security Administration, waiting in line, get up there, and the secretary that's sitting there at the desk, and I'm saying, well, the driver's license division says that we have to have a Social Security number to get his driver's license. And then she just says, U.S. citizens are not required to have Social Security numbers. So then we could talk to the field officer there, and he comes out and he explained it, and I says, well, you've got some documentation on something that doesn't exist? And he says, well, let me see what I can find and verify it. 2 weeks later, we exchanged emails and memorandum, and he put it in writing that U.S. citizens, there is no law in the Social Security regulations that require U.S. citizens to get a Social Security number. As he said, that's why you have to apply for it.
So, the Social Security Administration says that it is voluntary for citizens to participate in Social Security. Even though I am a U.S. citizen, since I have chosen not to apply for a Social Security number, I'm not able to get a driver's license, state picture ID, a bank account, legally be employed, or pay taxes. I'm a U.S. citizen that legally cannot work?
if you don't have a Social Security number, I think it's nearly impossible for an employer to hire you.
You are creating a problem for the government because it is difficult to track you. In a sense, you're an undocumented worker.
So I know, I believe there's still a mystery if we close our eyes and breathe. So I know.
I'm 20 years
Okay.
old and I can't work for you my whole life.
Well, what I did is because I knew it was going to be an issue when you did get 18 and turn 18, I went down to the Internal Revenue Service. I knew the time would come that there would be payroll taxes to deal with. And so over a 20-minute conversation, he'd come up there and says, well, you know, it's a crime to file a false W-4. And I says, well, does that crime apply if he doesn't have one to put on it? And then he goes, then he goes off and looks for another one. And then he comes back and says, well, there's a penalty for failure to provide a Social Security number on a W-4. $50 penalty. So will that penalty apply if he doesn't have one to put on it? And he finally, after trying to find something that would apply to you and couldn't, he finally just says, why don't you just pay him under the table? And I just backed off, so I pretend I didn't hear that. You know, I've gone back, talked to the various individuals, and they just ignore the situation.
Just over a year ago, my dad spoke with some tax experts about this issue. We decided to meet them and find out how my situation relates to the IRS.
You have to understand that Social Security is tied to the IRS. And the IRS is essentially a bill collector with a gun and a badge and government sanction.
IRS would view you as part of the underground economy that they've been trying to stop. True, part of that underground economy is illegal economy, which would be a lot of money, but a lot of people like you that just happen to be in the circumstance of no Social Security number, so you can't fill out the paperwork, the W-9 forms and the I-9s and get them in and get the documentation in to be a regular employee.
And under the I-9 requirements, which are part of U.S. law, which determines whether or not a person can be employed, you have to be able to provide proof of employment authorization. And one of the proofs of employment typically has been a Social Security card.
If you choose to be part of a team effort, an organization, a corporation, then to join that entity, you're going to probably have to conform to the rules, the law, as we understand it.
They have to get documentation and fill out the forms and look at and keep copies of 2 forms of ID. One is the driver's license or some pictured ID, and the Social Security card or work permit. If they don't have that, they're not supposed to employ you.
So there's really no advantage to hiring me. I'm in a complete disadvantage.
Exactly. It's a risk. You represent a risk to every employer now.
Do you think Americans have a right to work?
Certainly. I think it's a fundamental right and something that's really integral to anyone's development and existence. I mean, if you can't work, you can't make money, you can't eat, you can't have a place to live.
Well, I do work and I do have a place to live, but I make just enough money to cover my expenses. Will I be scraping by month to month the rest of my life? Has no one ran into this issue before? Could I be the only citizen trying to get by without a Social Security number? Well, it turns out I'm not. This is Jason Hommel. He actually sued a ski resort for not hiring him when he refused to give them his Social Security number. I called Jason up, and he agreed to meet me for an interview. Maybe there is hope for my numberless future. Maybe I don't have to work for my dad the rest of my life. So it was off to California to meet Jason.
The way I view where I am standing is all wrong. I've got a witness in my head, and I can't seem to stay. I've got a sickness in my head, and my hands begin to shake.
guys.
Don't be hella scared. Just go with it. Why did you live without a social security number?
Well, I got one when I was 5 years old, or I didn't really get one. My mom got one for me, so I really didn't have a choice. Very clearly, I was under the age of 18, so I was unable to make a legitimate contract, and I think the contract was invalid. And then when you are 18 and 19, it's, you get your first job. They ask you for your social security number. You give it to them unthinking, and that's what I did when I was 23, and I didn't know any better. But I learned more on the internet. When it came out, I was able to do some study and research, and even just paying attention to the news. You know that the social security system is not solvent.
We know it's not going to be around. So it is. There is a big social security problem, and it is a crisis.
Do you count on social security to be that?
That's a really good question. The answer is no. I don't.
It really is the safety net, and there's big holes in it. But if we didn't have that, what would we have? Yeah.
I've concluded, talking to my friends, that the best safety net is a job. So one way or another, I'll just keep working, hopefully doing something I really enjoy doing.
Why did you want to work at Squaw Valley so badly? Because it seems like you really wanted to get hired.
I really did. I grew up as a ski racer. I made it to the top 50 ranking in the United States in slalom. I was pretty good. In the national championships, I think I started about 65th or something, and I finished around 15th in one of the races at one time. I kept myself in shape, and by the time I was in around 30, I was much stronger than I was when I was ski racing at age 23. And so I figured I had both the ability to show people how it was done and to teach people. I was a very analytical mind. I was very technical oriented, and so I felt that teaching was the thing I wanted to do, and it would be a good way to take a break from all my study of theory of why we should be free. And I really wanted to try and put it into practice and try to get a job, at a place that really wanted me to work for them. Squaw Valley really wanted me to work for them because they don't find coaches who are top 50 in the nation, ski racers, who want to become a coach. So I knew I'd have allies because I knew I was going into battle in the first place. But the guy in charge of the head coaching program at about day 3 or 4 when I began to work for them, he said, "How come you don't have a number?" And I said, because you really don't need one. He says, "Well, yes, you do." I said, "Is that a law of Squaw Valley or is that the law of the United States?" He says, "It's a law of the real world." And I said, "Well, I don't think it is." He's like, "Well, until you can show me a lawyer that says that, you can't go up the hill again." And I said, "Well, here's the law that says I don't have to have a number. Here's a law that tells you what to do in the event an employee doesn't have a number. All you need to do is fill out a piece of paperwork that says, we tried to get our number from this guy, didn't have one, send it to the IRS, you're okay. You won't even be fined the $50, but if you're worried about the $50, I got $50 for you right here, it's no trouble." And he says, "Well, I can't hire you anyway." I said, "Well, how come?" "Because my boss tells me I can't."
If you don't have a social security number, you can fill out a signed affidavit, the employer can, that says, "I tried 3 times to obtain a social security number and I was not able to get this."
Yes.
And do you know anything about that?
You can fill that out, and you would send it in with your records, because you send in annual reports as an employer. And if you have an undocumented worker, which just like illegal aliens, you'd be an undocumented worker, then once you send in your first year's reports, you either get rid of your undocumented workers or they can come out and audit you, and you'd have several different agencies in your business.
So it really boiled down to one guy. The one guy is known as the controller. The controller is known as the chief financial officer of a group, and he handles all the paperwork, and it all goes through him. And he didn't have a vested interest in having a very good ski racer with top ability working for him. He just wanted to make sure all the paperwork was okay. And so I said, "Look, what you're doing is illegal. You can be held criminally liable." And he just didn't care. And we sent some letters back and forth. And he said, "Well, it's an EED requirement." I said, "Well, who's that?" He says, "Well, that's the Employment Development Department of California. It's their requirement." So I contacted the Employment Development Department, and I got a letter saying, "No, you don't need to have a social security number to live and work in the United States." And I showed it to him, and he says, "I don't care. See ya." And by then I was like, okay, well, fine, I'll have to sue then. I mean, I did everything possible to show people the law, and they just showed willful disregard for the truth of the law at every turn. Probably because they had a feeling that the judges of the land would rule in their favor, and they did. I remember I told you on the phone when we first talked, I said I was so proud of you for fighting this battle. I just absolutely couldn't believe that a man as young as you are was going through the same fight that I did through the court system, and it was just very encouraging. Well, why don't you have a Social Security number? What are your reasons?
First of all, it's normal for me not to have a Social Security number. The longer I live without one, the harder it is to see myself getting one. Not having a Social Security number has allowed me to question my relationship to the government in a way that most people don't understand. A lot of people think that I must be an illegal alien, or think that I'm doing something wrong by not getting a Social Security number. But what have I done wrong? Freedom has become too complicated. The United States government is supposed to protect our rights, not regulate them out of our hands. One day we might find ourselves so swamped with rules and regulations that we may very well forget what we as a people started this nation for. This is a place where every person is endowed with certain unalienable rights, among those, life, liberty, and happiness. Are we still born free, or is that something we have to apply for now? The reason I don't have a Social Security number is that I don't want one, and I'm free to make that choice.
Steve's got a kind of a nature that if something is not right, he'll get up and do something. Not so much that he'll take it on, it's just that he'll resist what comes at him. And that's all he's really done. He's shown, and I've helped him show him how the Constitution can act as a shield to protect him against government intrusion.